I'm Umbreon Libris, and you've probably seen this tweet, right? Comparing the graphics from Pokémon Sword and Shield to Horizon 2, which was just announced for the PS5. It's obviously bait, it's just trying to get engagement and clout, and, well, it succeeded. Several people responded to this by pointing out that the art style in these two games is very different, and that it's perfectly okay for two different games to look different. And obviously that is true, but I think it dismisses a very real flaw with Pokémon Sword and Shield. Their choice of art style was a bad one, and I think it hurts the game more than it helps. Let's do an overview of the art style used in past main series Pokemon games, starting with Gen 1 on the Game Boy. There wasn't much room for style back then. On a low-resolution gray screen, you need strong outlines and high contrast to make things stand out. This sort of cartoony approach where the characters have small bodies and big faces and there's relatively little detail was pretty common at the time. Pokemon battle screen sprites did take some risks, but in some cases that kind of backfired, and I thought this hiker had tiny arms and giant sausage finger hands. The hardware jumps onto the Game Boy Color and then onto the Game Boy Advance open up a lot of possibilities, but the Pokemon style doesn't deviate. You get more color and more detail, but we're still using pixel art with heavy outlines and that chibi character style, at least in the overworld where everyone has huge heads and tiny bodies. And in the battle screen, you have Pokemon that are very bright, very lively, they're drawn in exciting and dynamic poses, and they have short animations that really help to show off their personality. That became the Pokemon style. The stylistic difference between generations 3, 4, and 5 is relatively minimal. Again, there is an increase in detail, and considering the better hardware and the higher screen resolution, that makes sense. But the approach to drawing Pokemon is so similar that Pokemon sprites show almost no stylistic difference from Pokemon Ruby all the way to Black 2. There is a bit more difference in the overworld. Character sprites don't need to be quite as simplistic anymore, and objects and environments are rendered much more faithfully. But Pokemon has settled into this chibi, cartoony style. I would say that Heart Gold and Soul Silver is the most Pokemon that Pokemon has ever looked. Again, very bright, very colorful, very lively. And very cute, because that's what the chibi style does. It makes things look cute. And at the same time, the environments were very soft and inviting, and it was just a very friendly looking game. The jump to 3D in Generation 6 presented a number of challenges and stylistic questions. The possibilities were endless. They could have done literally anything. They were rebuilding everything from scratch. It would have been a great opportunity for them to experiment with the visual style of Pokemon and try something new. They didn't do it. The Gen 6 style, in particular in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, is a surprisingly faithful 3D recreation of the traditional 2D style. We still have strong outlines, we still have chibi characters, the overworld is still vibrant, and even though you have 8-directional movement now, the overworld is still blocked out in the same way it was before. And you can see that they're going for more detail in the textures, but we're still on a handheld screen, so that detail isn't very high. In battle, the situation isn't as good. The colors are toned down, and because Pokemon spend most of their times in an idle pose, we lose the dynamism from the sprites. A lot of the Pokemon lose character. The Alola games made, I think, the first significant departure from the traditional Pokemon style. No more chibi trainer models. Although we do still have strong outlines that actually kind of hide the level of detail in the models. The overworld also looks very different. It's more organic now since it doesn't rely on that grid layout anymore. And there is a lot more depth and detail to the environments. I think all of that is meant to help with immersion, with helping it feel like it's a real world that you could actually be living in. Showing the trainers in battle helps with that too. But I think it also means that the Alola games don't have a look that's as unique as the games that came before. Which brings us to the Switch for Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee with a very strong return to form. These games look gorgeous. I think stylistically, it's very close to the best possible adaptation of the classic 2D Pokemon style into an HD 3D environment. We don't have strong outlines anymore, and I know that some people weren't really down with that choice, but in a high-resolution screen with lots of contrast, we don't really need them anymore. And we do have trainers with more chibi proportions and blocky environments that don't look natural exactly, but look more the way we remember. And they look so lively, so beautiful, and with the Pokemon roaming in the overworld, it all feels incredibly alive. Textures have detail, but not too much. They know this is a cartoony game, and they're not trying to be realistic. And thankfully, Pokemon have finally got their color back. They're still a little bit static in battle, but with the colors being so bright and the shading being so soft and lovely, the boring poses don't stand out as much. And now we've finally arrived back at Pokémon Sword and Shield. The visuals in this game are disappointing. I feel like it's the natural evolution of the style from Sun and Moon, but the hardware leap from the 3DS to the Switch is huge, both in terms of the system processing power and in the screen size and resolution. And the graphical quality of the game just does not take that same leap. There are problems here with both the style itself and with the execution of that style, in particular in the wild area. But first, let's talk about what looks good. Most of the static, highly controlled environments look pretty good, especially the interiors. The level of detail here is perfect, both in the object and environment models and in their textures. This doesn't look like a perfectly realistic plant, but you can tell that it was sculpted and shaded with enough care that it looks perfectly natural within the context of this cartoony environment. And there are some exteriors that look gorgeous. I have said this before, and I will say it again. The shrine at the back of Slumbering Weald is the most beautiful location in any Pokemon game. The care they took here is very clear. The light filtering through the trees, the glittering air, it all just looks so peaceful. You can see the trees in the background are not carefully modeled, and if you look closely at the textures on the ground and on the stone arch itself, you'll see that they're a bit low resolution. They're trying to communicate more detail than they actually have. But the thing is that here, your eye is drawn away from these details. You don't spend your whole time carefully examining how well they rendered this rock. What you focus on is the ambience, the lights, the colors, and so the faults in the graphic style are sort of masked. Sword Chapter does the same thing. There are low resolution textures, but the steam, the snow, they all help create an ambience so that the whole works together really well and you don't pay as much attention to the flaws. If the whole game had that level of care, it would look wonderful. But it doesn't. The wild area is where the flaws really stand out, because as large and expansive as that space is, it's also really empty. You have nothing to see but these low-resolution textures on the ground, or these flowers and grasses and trees that not only look almost identical, but not quite, but also almost look like stock tree models from older 3D modeling software. The leaves on the trees, the little grasses on the ground, they are just flat. They're just placed to look like they're 3D. And this is where I think the problem lies. This game is trying to step up that immersion from the Alola games, like I talked about before. These textures, these trees that almost look like stock models, they are meant to look more realistic, but they fail. Miserably. Pokemon Sword and Shield are neither fully cartoony nor fully realistic, which means it ends up with this middle-of-the-road style that is absolutely characterless, and it fails to deliver on that realism and immersion. Realism is not everything. I actually have a significant bias against games that look realistic because I don't really think being realistic is a style. There are advantages to going realistic if you can really pull it off. You can make some really beautiful and immersive scenes if you have the hardware to render the details, the lighting, the fog, or whatever. But there isn't much to distinguish one realistic game from another, at least not in terms of the visual style, aside from the quality of the realism. I was utterly uninterested in the majority of the games showcased in that PS5 presentation, largely because they just look the same. And since realism is a product of hardware capabilities, those games really date themselves. In 5, 10, 20 years, those games are going to look off and uncanny. Think of how great the graphics looked in Twilight Princess, for example, back when it first released in 2006, compared to how it looks now. The alternative is to go for a more stylized look. Think of Paper Mario or Okami or Cuphead, or even a less stylized one like Breath of the Wild. Those are games that use their style to their advantage. I originally picked up Okami knowing absolutely nothing about it except that it looked interesting. It's just a really good adaptation of the traditional Japanese ukiyo-e style. What about the style of Okami or Cuphead would even be at risk of becoming outdated one day besides like screen resolution. Breath of the Wild maybe isn't quite like that, but it really leans into its cel-shaded anime-ish look. The environments are beautifully detailed and lit, but it's not trying to be realistic, not even close. Pokémon Sword and Shield do aim for a certain level of realism in the outdoor environments, but they don't get there. Things are a little bit less egregious in the Isle of Armor, the DLC that just came out a couple of days ago. This part of the map is entirely wild area, but they took a lot more care with it. There's a lot more variation in the environments here, from big expansive fields to cramped caves and crowded forests. And they're way more populated in terms of having like objects and plants and such just strewn about, so you're not as often left with just giant swaths of bad ground textures in front of you, although it does happen. Look, it's not like I expect them to manually sculpt hundreds or thousands of individual trees or craft perfect non-repeating patterns on the ground. But they don't have to. In Let's Go, the trees look like they might not be manually modeled, but aside from having a few different kinds of trees, they're all the same. These trees look identical. These patches of flower look identical. But nothing here is trying to be realistic. In the originals, the map was very repetitive, so this repetition is part of the style of this game and part of the charm of the visuals here. I don't want a Pokemon game that looks like Horizon 2. I want a Pokemon game that looks like a Pokemon game. Or at least if you're going to try different styles, which you should, either take that realism seriously or pick a style with real character. Thank you for watching. I know that a lot of people are going to have very different takes on this, so I hope we can continue the conversation down in the comments. Thank you to my patrons, especially luxury patron Ethan Saffron. I'm Umbrian Libris. I'll see you in the next chapter.